She disobeyed her mother to help a homeless man during winter. When she discovered who he really was, her small act of kindness changed both their lives forever. The subway rumbled overhead as Jasmine walked down the crowded Brooklyn street, her colorful braids bouncing with each step. The morning air bit at her cheeks, and she pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. Her backpack felt heavier than usual today. Her mom had packed extra sandwiches again. "Don't forget your lunch, baby." Her mother's voice echoed from earlier that morning as she rushed around their small apartment kitchen in her waitress uniform. "I made your favorite, turkey and cheese." "Thanks, Mom," Jasmine had mumbled, watching her mother pack not one, but two sandwiches in her lunch bag. Her mom always made extra, worried that Jasmine might still be hungry after school. Now, walking past the familiar stores and faces of her neighborhood, Jasmine stepped slowed as she approached the corner of Malcolm X Boulevard. She knew he would be there. He always was. Mr. Thompson sat in his usual spot, his gray jacket worn thin at the elbows, his silver hair catching the weak morning sunlight. "Morning, little lady," Mrs. Rodriguez called from her flower shop. "Better hurry, you'll be late for school." Jasmine nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on Mr. Thompson. He wasn't like the other homeless people she saw around the neighborhood. He sat quietly, never asking for anything, his eyes focused on something far away that only he could see. "Now, Jasmine," her mother's voice rang in her head, "don't you ever talk to strangers on the street. The world isn't safe like it used to be." The words had been repeated so many times they might as well have been tattooed on her brain. But something about Mr. Thompson was different. She'd noticed him first about a month ago when the weather started turning cold. He always wore the same clothes, clean but threadbare, and kept to himself. A gust of wind whipped down the street, sending papers flying and making people pull their coats tighter. Mr. Thompson shivered visibly, his thin jacket offering little protection against the cold. Jasmine stopped walking. Her hand went to her backpack, feeling the shape of her lunch bag inside. Two sandwiches. Her mom always packed two. The National Weather Service has issued a winter storm warning, blared a radio from a passing car. Temperatures expected to drop into the 20s tonight. Mr. Thompson coughed, a deep, rattling sound that made Jasmine's chest hurt just hearing it. She watched as he pulled his knees closer to his chest, trying to conserve what little warmth he had. Her mother's warning played again in her head, "Don't talk to strangers." But she couldn't stop thinking about those two sandwiches in her bag. Her mom had packed them because she wanted to make sure Jasmine had enough to eat. But right now, someone else needed that food more than she did. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said softly, her heart pounding as she took a step closer to him. He looked up slowly, his eyes focusing on her face with surprise. It was the first time she'd ever spoken to him, the first time she'd seen his eyes clearly. They were a warm brown, like her father's had been. "Good morning," he replied, his voice rough from disuse, but gentle. He seemed startled that someone was actually talking to him. Jasmine's hands trembled as she unzipped her backpack. "Would you like a sandwich?" "My mom always packs extra." Mr. Thompson stared at her, then at the carefully wrapped sandwich she held out. For a moment, neither of them moved. The sounds of the city continued around them. Cars honking, people talking, the subway rumbling overhead. But in that moment, it was just them. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I want to," Jasmine replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "It's turkey and cheese." His hands, when he finally reached for the sandwich, were clean but shaking slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. The first bell rang in the distance. Jasmine knew she should run. She was going to be late for school. But something made her stay for just a moment longer. "I'm Jasmine," she said. "Thank you, Jasmine," Mr. Thompson replied, holding the sandwich like it was something precious. I'm Thomas." A second bell rang, more urgent this time. Jasmine adjusted her backpack and turned to go, but not before she saw Mr. Thompson carefully unwrap the sandwich, his movements slow and deliberate. As she ran toward school, her heart was racing, partly from running, partly from what she'd just done. She knew her mother would be furious if she found out. But something about Mr. Thompson's gentle thank you made her feel like she'd done the right thing. She made it to class just as the final bell rang, sliding into her seat as Mrs. Williams began taking attendance. Her own lunch would be smaller today, but the memory of Mr. Thompson's grateful eyes made her stomach feel full already. Throughout the morning, she found herself thinking about him. Would he be there tomorrow? Would he remember her? Should she bring him another sandwich? The question spun in her head as she tried to focus on her math problems during lunch. She sat with her best friend Maria, who noticed her picking at her half sandwich. "You're not hungry?" Maria asked, mouthful of pizza. "Just saving some for later," Jasmine lied, thinking of Mr. Thompson and wondering if he'd eaten the whole sandwich at once or saved some for later too. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of lessons and worksheets, but Jasmine's mind kept wandering back to that corner. As the final bell rang and students rushed to pack up their things, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she'd bring him another sandwich. Her mom didn't need to know. It would be her secret mission. Walking home that afternoon, she took a different route, avoiding Malcolm X Boulevard. She wasn't ready to see if Mr. Thompson was still there, wasn't ready to face the reality of what she'd done. But she knew tomorrow morning she'd be back. That evening, as her mom prepared dinner between phone calls about her upcoming work shifts, Jasmine watched her make lunches for the next day. "2 sandwiches again, Mom?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Of course, baby. You're a growing girl." Her mother smiled, dark circles under her eyes from working double shifts. "Need to keep you healthy and strong." Jasmine hugged her mother tight, guilt and determination warring in her chest. Tomorrow, she would help Mr. Thompson again. She just hoped her mother would understand if she ever found out. The next morning arrived with a biting wind that made Jasmine's eyes water. She'd woken up early, heart pounding, and double-checked her backpack 3 times to make sure she had both sandwiches. Her hands felt sweaty despite the cold as she approached Malcolm X Boulevard. Mr. Thompson sat in his usual spot, shoulders hunched against the wind. Today he had a newspaper spread across his lap, his fingers tracing the lines of text carefully. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Good morning, Jasmine." She noticed how he remembered her name, how he said it carefully, like it mattered. Her fingers fumbled with her backpack zipper as she pulled out the sandwich. "Turkey and cheese again," she said, holding it out. Mr. Rodriguez stepped out of his bodega across the street, his eyes narrowing as he watched their interaction. "Hey, little girl, you shouldn't be talking to." "It's okay, Mr. Rodriguez," Jasmine called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's my friend." Mr. Thompson's hands trembled as he accepted the sandwich. "You don't have to defend me," he said quietly. "And you don't have to keep bringing me food." "I want to," Jasmine replied, settling down on the sidewalk next to him, keeping a careful distance. "What are you reading?" He smoothed the newspaper with weathered hands. "The business section. Force of habit, I suppose. You like business stuff?" A small smile crossed his face. "I used to be an accountant. Numbers were my whole life. Once upon a time." Mrs. Chun from the laundromat across the street started sweeping her storefront, shooting disapproving looks their way. Jasmine felt the weight of the neighbors' stares but tried to ignore them. "An accountant? That's like math, right?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Yes, quite a bit of math." He carefully folded the newspaper. "I used to help big companies manage their money, make sure everything balanced out properly." A group of students walked past, whispering and pointing. Jasmine recognized some kids from her class, but kept her eyes fixed on the newspaper in Mr. Thompson's hands. "Why did you stop?" she asked before she could stop herself. His face clouded over. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, Jasmine. Sometimes the numbers stop making sense, and then nothing makes sense anymore." The first warning bell rang in the distance. Jasmine stood up, brushing off her pants. "I have to go to school now." "Thank you for the sandwich," Mr. Thompson said. "And thank you for talking to me. Most people pretend they can't see me." Jasmine felt something squeeze in her chest. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Thompson." Throughout the school day, Jasmine couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Thompson had said about being an accountant. During math class, she wondered if he could solve all these problems easily. When Ms. Williams wrote equations on the board, she imagined Mr. Thompson in a nice suit, working in a tall building with a big desk. At lunch, Maria noticed her distraction. Earth to Jasmine. "What's going on with you lately?" "Nothing," Jasmine said quickly, too quickly. "Just thinking about stuff." Is it about that homeless man I saw you talking to this morning? Maria lowered her voice. My mom says we shouldn't talk to homeless people. They might be dangerous. Jasmine felt her face get hot. He's not dangerous. He's nice, and he used to be an accountant. How do you know he's telling the truth? Before Jasmine could answer, Ms. Peterson, their school counselor, appeared at their table. Jasmine, could I speak with you for a moment? Jasmine's stomach dropped. Had someone reported her? She followed Ms. Peterson to her office, her legs feeling like lead. Some teachers have noticed you talking to a homeless man near the school, Ms. Peterson said once they were seated. We're concerned about your safety. Mr. Thompson isn't dangerous, Jasmine protested. He's just hungry and cold. Ms. Peterson's face softened. Your heart's in the right place, sweetie, but there are proper channels to help the homeless. Does your mother know about this? Jasmine stared at her shoes. No, ma'am. I think you should tell her. And maybe we can look into some local shelters that could help Mr. Thompson. He won't go to a shelter, Jasmine said, though she wasn't sure how she knew this. He just needs someone to be nice to him. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of worry. Would Ms. Peterson call her mom? Would she get in trouble? By the time she got home, her stomach was in knots. Her mother was already home, sitting at their small kitchen table with an unusual look on her face. Sit down, Jasmine. We need to talk. Jasmine's heart stopped. Mom, Mrs. Rodriguez called me at work today. Her mother said, her voice tight. Said she saw you talking to a homeless man this morning. Giving him food? His name is Mr. Thompson, Jasmine said quietly. He used to be an accountant. I don't care if he used to be the president. Her mother's voice rose. What have I told you about talking to strangers? About keeping yourself safe. But he's not dangerous, Mom. He's just hungry and... No buts. Her mother slammed her hand on the table, making Jasmine jump. You will not talk to him again. You will not give him food. You will take a different route to school. Do you understand me? Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes. Yes, Mom. Promise me, Jasmine. Promise me you won't go near him again. I promise, Jasmine whispered, crossing her fingers behind her back. That night, Jasmine lay in bed listening to the weather report through her window. The announcer's voice carried clearly. Record low temperatures expected this week. Snow and ice likely by Wednesday. She thought about Mr. Thompson in his thin jacket, about how his hands shook when he held the newspaper, about how he was the only person who seemed to really see her, really listen to her. Her mother's words echoed in her head. Promise me you won't go near him again. But as she drifted off to sleep, Jasmine had already made up her mind. Sometimes breaking a promise was the right thing to do. Sometimes being kind was more important than being obedient. Tomorrow, she would take 2 sandwiches to school again. She would just have to be more careful about it. Jasmine, baby, are you sure you're eating enough? Her mother stood at the kitchen counter, examining Jasmine's lunch containers from the past week. These come back barely touched. Jasmine kept her eyes fixed on her cereal bowl. I'm just not very hungry at lunch lately. Not hungry? You used to finish everything. Her mother pressed the back of her hand against Jasmine's forehead. Are you feeling sick? I'm fine, Mom. Really? Outside, the weather had turned nastier. Dark clouds hung low over Brooklyn, threatening snow. Jasmine packed her bag quickly, trying to avoid more questions about her eating habits. When she reached Malcolm X Boulevard, her heart sank. Mr. Thompson looked worse than ever. His silver hair was matted against his forehead, and his cough sounded deeper, more painful. You don't look so good, Jasmine said, crouching beside him. Mr. Thompson tried to smile, but it turned into another cough. Just a cold. Nothing to worry about. She pulled out both sandwiches today. You need to eat more. Your mother's going to notice, he said, but accepted the food with trembling hands. She already has. Jasmine sat down, ignoring the wet sidewalk, soaking through her pants. But I don't care. You need it more than I do. Mr. Thompson unwrapped one sandwich slowly. I used to make lunches for my son, he said quietly. Every morning before school. Turkey and cheese was his favorite too. You have a son? Had. Have. I'm not sure anymore. He took a small bite, chewing carefully. William. He'd be about 35 now. Works at some big company downtown. Why don't you talk to him? Mr. Thompson's eyes grew distant. Depression is a funny thing, Jasmine. It makes you push away the people who love you most. Makes you think they're better off without you. But they're not better off without you, Jasmine said fiercely. No, he agreed softly. I see that now. But by the time I realized it, too much time had passed. Too many bridges burned. A sleek car pulled up to the curb across the street. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, talking on his phone. Mr. Thompson ducked his head, pulling his jacket collar up. Is that him? Your son? No, Mr. Thompson said quickly. Just someone I used to know? The man walked into the coffee shop without looking their way. Mr. Thompson's shoulders relaxed slightly. Mr. Thompson, if you told your son you were sorry. Jasmine, Ms. Peterson's voice cut through the morning air. What do we discuss about this? Jasmine jumped to her feet. The school counselor stood a few feet away, concern etched on her face. I need to call your mother about this, Ms. Peterson said. Please don't, Jasmine begged. She already knows. She said it was okay. The lie felt bitter on her tongue. Ms. Peterson looked skeptical. I'll be speaking with her anyway. This isn't safe, Jasmine. But, no buts. Get to class. Now. Jasmine looked back at Mr. Thompson, who had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the ground. I'm sorry, she whispered. In class, she couldn't focus. Her mind kept going back to Mr. Thompson's words about his son, about depression. She barely noticed when Mrs. Williams called on her. Jasmine? The answer to question 7? Sorry, what? Are you with us today? Mrs. Williams asked. You seem distracted. By lunchtime, Jasmine's stomach was in knots. She sat alone, not wanting to face Maria's questions or concerned looks. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother, coming to pick you up after school. We need to talk. The rest of the afternoon crawled by. When the final bell rang, Jasmine walked slowly to the front entrance. Her mother's old Honda was parked at the curb, engine running. The car ride home was silent. It wasn't until they were inside their apartment that her mother spoke. Miss Peterson called me at work. Her voice was tight with anger and fear. Said you're still talking to that homeless man. After you promised me you wouldn't. His name is Mr. Thompson, Jasmine said. And he needs help. That's not your responsibility. Her mother's voice cracked. You're 10 years old, Jasmine. 10. Do you know how dangerous this is? He's not dangerous. He's sick, and he's sad, and he misses his son. His son? Her mother's eyes narrowed. He's been telling you about his family? He used to be an accountant, Jasmine continued, words tumbling out. He got depression and lost everything. His son works downtown, but doesn't know where he is, and he's too ashamed to tell him. And now he's sick, and it's getting colder, and enough. Her mother grabbed Jasmine's shoulders. Listen to me. Really listen. Men like that, they'll say anything for sympathy. Make up stories about lost families, good jobs. You can't believe everything you hear. He's not lying. Tears streamed down Jasmine's face. I know he's not. You are not to go near him again. At this time, her mother's voice was steel. I'm driving you to school from now on. Every morning. That's not fair. Life isn't fair. But my job is to keep you safe, whether you like it or not. Jasmine ran to her room, slamming the door. She threw herself on her bed, sobs shaking her small frame. Through her window, she could hear the weather report from the neighbor's radio. Severe weather warning for the greater New York area. Temperatures expected to drop into the teens overnight. Heavy snow beginning around midnight. She thought about Mr. Thompson in his thin jacket, about his painful cough, about his son somewhere in the city, not knowing his father was suffering just blocks away. Her mother's footsteps approached her door. Jasmine? Dinner's ready. I'm not hungry. A pause. You need to eat, baby. You've been skipping too many meals lately. Jasmine didn't respond. She lay there until she heard her mother's footsteps retreat, then got up and went to her closet. Her winter coat hung there, warm and thick. The one her mom had saved up to buy her last Christmas. Tomorrow would be even colder. Tomorrow, Mr. Thompson would need more than just sandwiches. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered to her empty room. But sometimes you have to break promises to do the right thing. She packed her backup plan into her school bag. Her warmest coat, an extra sandwich, and the emergency $20 bill her mom had given her for emergencies. This definitely counted as an emergency. The morning air cut like knives through Jasmine's clothes as she hurried down the street. Her mother had left early for a breakfast shift, trusting Jasmine to take the bus to school. Instead, she clutched her winter coat close to her chest, hidden inside her backpack, and walked her usual route. Snow had fallen overnight, turning Brooklyn into a different world. Her sneakers crunched through fresh powder, leaving tiny footprints in the otherwise untouched white blanket. The streets were quieter than usual, most people choosing to stay inside. Her heart nearly stopped when she reached Malcolm X Boulevard. Mr. Thompson wasn't in his usual spot. "Mr. Thompson," she called out softly, panic rising in her throat. A weak cough answered from the alley next to the bodega. She found him huddled behind a dumpster, seeking shelter from the wind. "You shouldn't be here," he said through chattering teeth. "Not in this weather." His face looked gray in the weak morning light, his lips tinged slightly blue. The newspaper he usually sat on was soaked through with melted snow. "I brought you something." Jasmine pulled out her winter coat. "You need this more than I do." "No." He shook his head firmly despite his shivering. "Your mother bought that for you." "I can't." "Please," Jasmine interrupted, holding it out. "You'll freeze without it." A car honked nearby, making them both jump. Through the swirling snow, Jasmine saw her mother's Honda driving past the bodega. She ducked behind the dumpster, heart pounding, until the car passed. "That was close," she whispered. "Too close," Mr. Thompson agreed. "Jasmine, you can't keep risking." His words dissolved into a violent coughing fit that seemed to shake his whole body. "Put the coat on," Jasmine insisted. "Please." With trembling hands, he accepted the coat. It was too small for him, but he managed to get it around his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered. "I brought breakfast too." She pulled out 2 sandwiches and the $20 bill. "And this is for coffee. To keep warm." Mr. Thompson stared at the money. "I can't take that. It's for emergencies," Jasmine said. "And this is definitely an emergency." He closed his eyes, a tear freezing on his cheek. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's right," Jasmine said simply. "And because everyone deserves someone who cares about them." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Mr. Rodriguez appeared at the alley entrance, surprise crossing his face. "Jasmine? What are you?" His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. "Is that your coat?" "Mr. Rodriguez, please don't tell my mom," Jasmine begged. The bodega owner looked conflicted. "It's not safe for you to be out here, especially not in this weather." "Please," she repeated. "He's sick. He needs help." Mr. Rodriguez studied Mr. Thompson for a long moment. "There's a shelter on Bedford Avenue," he said finally. "They have warm beds, medical care, no shelters," Mr. Thompson said firmly, trying to stand but swaying slightly. "I'm fine here." "You're not fine," Jasmine protested. "You're sick." "The girl's right," Mr. Rodriguez said. "This weather, it's only getting worse." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "I appreciate the concern, but another coughing fit cut him off, this one worse than before." Jasmine reached for him instinctively, but Mr. Rodriguez pulled her back. "School," he said firmly. "Now. I'll keep an eye on him. Promise?" "Yes, yes. Now go, before you're late." Jasmine looked back at Mr. Thompson, who had slumped against the wall, her coat pulled tight around his shoulders. "I'll be back after school," she promised. "No," Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Thompson said simultaneously. But Jasmine was already running, her backpack bouncing against her spine, tears freezing on her cheeks. At school, she couldn't focus on anything. Every time the wind howled outside the classroom windows, she thought of Mr. Thompson in that alley. Even with her coat, would it be enough? During lunch, she sat by the window, watching the snow fall harder. Maria joined her, sliding a cup of hot chocolate across the table. "You look cold," Maria said. "Where's your winter coat?" "I forgot it," Jasmine lied. Maria frowned. "You never forget your coat. What's really going on?" Before Jasmine could answer, she saw her mother's car pull into the school parking lot. Her stomach dropped. "I have to go," she said, grabbing her bag. "Cover for me?" Jasmine, wait, but she was already running, ducking through the cafeteria doors and down the empty hallway. She burst out the side entrance into the swirling snow. Her mother's car was at the front of the school. If she was quick, she could circle around back and Jasmine. She froze. Her mother stood by the corner of the building, arms crossed. What are you doing out here without a coat? I, I, where is it? Her mother's voice was dangerously quiet. Where is your coat, Jasmine? Before she could answer, Miss Peterson appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Walker, could you come to my office? We need to discuss something. The meeting was brief, but intense. Jasmine sat in the hard plastic chair, shivering, as her mother learned everything. The daily food sharing, the conversations, the coat. She's putting herself in danger, Miss Peterson explained gently. We're concerned about her safety, but also her health. She's been giving away her lunches, and now her coat. I had no idea it had gone this far, her mother whispered, looking at Jasmine like she was seeing her for the first time. There are proper channels to help the homeless, Miss Peterson continued. I can provide some resources. He won't go to a shelter, Jasmine interrupted. He's too proud. And he's really sick, Mom. His cough is getting worse, and now with this weather. Enough! Her mother stood up. We're going home. Now! The car ride was silent. Jasmine pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching familiar streets pass by. As they approached Malcolm X Boulevard, she sat up straighter. The alley was empty. Looking for your friend? Her mother asked quietly. Mr. Rodriguez called me earlier. Said you were there this morning. Where is he? Jasmine asked, panic rising in her voice. Mom, we have to find him. This isn't your responsibility, Jasmine. You're a child. You can't save everyone. But who else will help him? Her mother didn't answer. They drove the rest of the way home in silence, but as they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Jasmine made a decision. Tonight, after her mother fell asleep, she would go back. She had to find Mr. Thompson, had to make sure he was okay. She just hoped she wouldn't be too late. The clock read 2:37 a.m. when Jasmine slipped out of bed. She'd waited until her mother's breathing became deep and regular before moving. Every creak of the floor made her freeze, heart pounding. She pulled on 3 sweaters and her old fall jacket. Not as warm as her winter coat, but better than nothing. Her emergency flashlight beam bounced off the walls as she crept to the front door. The lock clicked impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. And where do you think you're going? Jasmine spun around. Her mother stood in the hallway, still in her waitress uniform. I have to find him, Jasmine said, hand still on the doorknob. He's sick, Mom. Really sick. It's the middle of the night, Jasmine, and it's 15 degrees outside. Exactly. That's why I have to know. Her mother's voice cracked like a whip. You're not going anywhere. Then you have to help me find him. Tears spilled down Jasmine's cheeks. Please, Mom. Please. Her mother stared at her for a long moment. Then she sighed, shoulders slumping. Get your shoes on. We'll drive around the neighborhood. Once. Then this stops. 10 minutes later, they cruised slowly down Malcolm X Boulevard, wipers pushing away fresh snow. The streets were empty, streetlights creating halos in the swirling white. There! Jasmine pressed her face against the window. A figure huddled in her winter coat was visible behind the dumpster. Her mother pulled over, engine idling. Stay in the car. But stay in the car. Jasmine watched her mother approach the alley carefully. Mr. Thompson didn't move as she got closer. Sir? Her mother's voice carried in the quiet night. Mr. Thompson? No response. Mom! Jasmine was out of the car before she realized she was moving. Something's wrong. She reached him first. Mr. Thompson's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and raspy. Her winter coat was pulled tight around him, but he still shivered violently. He's burning up, her mother said, hand on his forehead. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling an ambulance. No. Mr. Thompson's eyes fluttered open. No hospitals. Sir, you have a dangerous fever. You need medical attention. Can't afford. His words slurred together. That doesn't matter right now, her mother said firmly, already dialing. Hello? Yes, we need an ambulance at Malcolm X Boulevard and Green Avenue. Jasmine held Mr. Thompson's hand while they waited. It felt like ice despite his fever. William, he mumbled. Need to tell William. Who's William? Her mother asked, crouching beside them. His son, Jasmine explained. He works at some big company downtown. Thompson. Mr. Thompson's voice was barely a whisper. William Thompson? Stellar Investments. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Red and blue lights painted the snow in strange colors. Everything happened very fast after that. Paramedics swarmed the alley. They lifted Mr. Thompson onto a stretcher, wrapping him in silver emergency blankets. "Family," one of them asked. "No," Jasmine's mother answered. "But I think we might know how to contact them. Hospital policy is immediate family only. His son works at Stellar Investments." "William Thompson." The paramedic nodded, making a note. "We'll try to contact him. Which of you is coming in the ambulance?" "I am," Jasmine's mother said. She turned to Jasmine. "Baby, I need you to go to Mrs. Rodriguez's. I already called her. She's expecting you." "No, I want to come with you." "Jasmine." Her mother knelt down, gripping her shoulders. "You've done enough. More than enough. Now let the adults handle this." The ambulance doors slammed shut. Jasmine watched it pull away, sirens screaming into the night. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside her, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders. "Come, Nina. Let's get you inside." The bodega's back room smelled like coffee and fresh bread. Mrs. Rodriguez made hot chocolate while Jasmine sat at their small kitchen table, still shivering. "Your mother is a good woman," Mrs. Rodriguez said, setting a steaming mug in front of her. "She'll make sure he's taken care of." "I should have done something sooner," Jasmine whispered. "I knew he was sick." "You did more than most adults would do." Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed her shoulder. "Now try to rest. Your mother will call when there's news." But Jasmine couldn't rest. She sat by the window, watching the snow fall, until the sky began to lighten. Her mother finally called around 7. "He's stable," she said, sounding exhausted. "They're treating him for pneumonia and hypothermia." "Did they find his son?" A pause. "They're working on it." "Listen, baby, I need you to go to school today. I'll pick you up after." "No, I want to come to the hospital." "Jasmine." Her mother's voice was firm but gentle. "There's nothing you can do here. He's sleeping, and they only allow family in the ICU anyway. But no buts. Mrs. Rodriguez will walk you to school. I'll pick you up this afternoon, and we'll talk about everything then." "Okay. Okay," Jasmine whispered. School was a blur. She couldn't focus on anything, checking her phone constantly for updates from her mother. Maria tried to ask what was going on, but Jasmine couldn't find the words to explain. Finally, the last bell rang. She ran to the parking lot, where her mother's car waited. "How is he?" she asked before the door was fully closed. "About the same." Her mother looked as tired as Jasmine had ever seen her. "But they found his son." "They did. He's on his way to the hospital now." Her mother pulled away from the curb. "And we need to talk about what happens next." "What do you mean?" "Jasmine." Her mother gripped the steering wheel tight. "What you did, going out in the middle of the night, giving away your food and coat. It was dangerous. You could have gotten hurt or sick. I had to help him. I know your heart was in the right place. But you're 10 years old. You can't take on everyone's problems. He wasn't just everyone." Tears spilled down Jasmine's cheeks. "He was my friend, and he needed help, and nobody else would help him. And, baby," her mother pulled the car over suddenly, turning to face her. "Listen to me. Really listen. You have such a big heart. You see someone hurting, and you want to fix it. That's beautiful. But it's also scary for me, as your mother, to watch you put yourself at risk. I was careful. You snuck out in the middle of the night. In a snowstorm." Her mother's voice cracked. "Do you know what could have happened to you?" Jasmine stared at her hands. "I'm sorry I scared you." "I know you are." Her mother sighed deeply. "And I'm sorry too. Sorry I didn't listen when you first told me about him. Sorry I didn't see what you saw. That sometimes the scary people aren't really scary at all. They're just hurting and alone." They sat in silence for a moment, wipers pushing away fresh snow. "Can we go see him?" Jasmine asked finally. "Please?" Her mother checked her phone. "His son should be there by now. We should give him some privacy." "But tomorrow," her mother promised. "If the doctors say it's okay, we'll visit tomorrow." As they drove home, Jasmine thought about Mr. Thompson in the hospital, hopefully warm for the first time in months. She thought about his son, rushing to see the father he'd lost. And she thought about her own mother working double shifts and worrying about her, and still finding time to make extra sandwiches, just in case someone needed them. "Mom?" "Yes, baby?" "I love you." Her mother reached over, squeezing her hand. I love you too, even when you scare me half to death. That night, as the snow continued to fall outside her window, Jasmine slept better than she had in weeks. Mr. Thompson was safe. Help had finally come. Sometimes she realized as she drifted off, breaking the rules was the only way to do the right thing. And sometimes the scariest part wasn't breaking the rules at all. It was admitting that you needed help to fix something bigger than yourself. The hospital waiting room smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. Jasmine sat between her mother and Mrs. Rodriguez, swinging her legs nervously. They'd been waiting for almost an hour. Maybe we should come back tomorrow, her mother said quietly. Please, just a little longer, Jasmine begged. I just want to know he's okay. The elevator doors opened, and a tall man in an expensive suit rushed out, speaking rapidly into his phone. I don't care about the meeting. Cancel everything for the week. My father needs me. Jasmine sat up straighter. The man looked like a younger, healthier version of Mr. Thompson. William, her mother called softly. He turned, phone dropping to his side. Are you the ones who found my father? Jasmine stood up. Is Mr. Thompson okay? William's eyes were red-rimmed, his tie slightly crooked. He's stable. The doctors say he has severe pneumonia, but they caught it in time. He ran a hand through his hair. I can't believe all these months he was right here in Brooklyn. You didn't know? Jasmine asked. I've been looking for him for over a year. William sank into a chair, shoulders slumping. After Mom died, he changed. The depression hit him hard. One day, he just disappeared. Left a note saying we were better off without him. That's what depression does, Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. Makes you think the lies are true. I hired private investigators. Put up missing person reports. But he didn't want to be found. William looked at Jasmine. Until you found him anyway. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Thompson, your father's awake. He's asking for you. And for someone named Jasmine. Jasmine looked at her mother, who nodded slowly. Go ahead, baby. We'll wait here. The ICU was quieter than the rest of the hospital. Machines beeped softly in regular rhythms. Mr. Thompson lay in a bed by the window, looking small under the white hospital blankets, but cleaner and more peaceful than Jasmine had ever seen him. There's my guardian angel, he said weakly, managing a small smile. Jasmine rushed to his bedside, then stopped, unsure if it was okay to touch him with all the tubes and wires. It's okay, William said, pulling up chairs for both of them. Just be gentle. I was so worried, Jasmine said, carefully taking Mr. Thompson's hand. It was warm now, no longer ice-cold like in the alley. I'm sorry I scared you. Mr. Thompson's voice was hoarse. And I'm sorry I try to push you away. Sometimes it's harder to accept help than to give it. Dad, William's voice cracked. Why didn't you let me help you? I've been searching everywhere. I was ashamed. Mr. Thompson closed his eyes. After your mother died, I couldn't keep the numbers straight anymore. Couldn't focus. Lost my job. Started forgetting to pay bills. Everything just spiraled. You could have come to me. You had your own life. Your own family. I didn't want to be a burden. You're my father. William grabbed his other hand. You could never be a burden. A doctor appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. I need to check his vitals. Perhaps we could continue this conversation later? In the hallway, William pulled out his wallet. Jasmine, I can never repay you for what you did, but no. Jasmine shook her head firmly. I didn't help Mr. Thompson for money. Then let me do something. Anything. Jasmine thought for a moment. Just promise you won't let him be alone again? William knelt down to her level. I promise. In fact, I've been thinking, my house has a guest suite. Once he's better, maybe he could live with you? If he'll agree. William smiled sadly. Might have to work on that. He's still pretty stubborn. Tell him you need help with numbers, Jasmine suggested. He likes feeling useful. William laughed, then grew serious. You know, my daughter Emma is about your age. She's been wanting to learn about accounting, but I'm hopeless at explaining it. Maybe once Dad settled in. Back in the waiting room, Jasmine found her mother talking quietly with a hospital social worker. There are programs that can help with the medical bills, the social worker was saying. And resources for mental health treatment, housing assistance. I'll handle all of that, William interrupted. Whatever he needs. He turned to Jasmine's mother. Ms. Walker? Could we talk privately for a moment? They stepped away, speaking in low voices. Jasmine watched her mother's eyes widen, then narrow, then slowly nod. What was that about? Jasmine asked when her mother returned. William offered me a job, her mother said, sounding dazed. In his company's HR department. Says they need someone with real-world experience in handling difficult situations with compassion. Are you going to take it? Maybe. It would mean better hours, better pay. She squeezed Jasmine's hand. No more double shifts. Mrs. Rodriguez clapped her hands. This calls for celebration. Dinner at my place tonight. My famous arroz con pollo. As they walked to the elevator, Jasmine glanced back at Mr. Thompson's room. Through the window, she could see William sitting by his father's bed, their heads close together in conversation. He's going to be okay now, right? She asked. Her mother pulled her close. Yes, baby. Thanks to you, he's going to be okay. I didn't do that much, Jasmine protested. Just shared some sandwiches. You did more than that, her mother said. You saw someone hurting, and you didn't look away. You showed him he wasn't invisible. Sometimes that's all people need, to know that someone sees them, someone cares. In Mrs. Rodriguez's cozy kitchen that evening, surrounded by the smell of saffron and the sound of laughter, Jasmine thought about how one small decision, sharing a sandwich with a stranger, had changed so many lives. Her mother was telling Mrs. Rodriguez about the new job opportunity. It's in Manhattan, but they have flexible hours and the benefits. Manhattan? Mrs. Rodriguez exclaimed. Our little Brooklyn girl is moving up in the world. We're not moving, her mother clarified quickly. This is our home. Our community? Jasmine smiled, thinking of Mr. Thompson in his hospital bed, no longer alone. Thinking of William and his family, ready to welcome him home. Thinking of her mother, finally getting the job she deserved. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the biggest changes. Sometimes all it took was one person brave enough to reach out, to see past appearances and fear, to recognize the humanity in everyone. And sometimes, Jasmine realized the rules grown-ups made to keep you safe had to bend a little to let love in. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits and changes. Mr. Thompson's room in the ICU gradually filled with cards from Jasmine's classmates, colorful drawings from William's daughter Emma, and fresh flowers that Mrs. Rodriguez brought every few days. The doctors say I can leave next week, Mr. Thompson told Jasmine during one of her after-school visits. His voice was stronger now, and some color had returned to his face. Are you going to live with William? Mr. Thompson shifted in his bed, adjusting the oxygen tube in his nose. He wants me too. Keeps talking about this guest suite they have, but you're not sure? Jasmine could hear the hesitation in his voice. It's not that simple. He sighed. I've been on my own for so long. And I'm not the same man I was before. Maybe that's okay, Jasmine said, arranging the get well cards on his bedside table. Maybe you don't have to be the same. A knock on the door interrupted them. A woman in a neat blue suit entered, carrying a folder. Mr. Thompson? I'm Dr. Chun, the hospital's psychiatric counselor. Do you feel up to talking? Jasmine started to gather her things, but Mr. Thompson caught her hand. Stay, please. Dr. Chun smiled. Family support is important in recovery. You're welcome to stay if Mr. Thompson wants you here. They spent the next hour talking about depression, about grief, about the shame that had driven Mr. Thompson onto the streets. Jasmine held his hand as he described the day his wife died, how the numbers at work suddenly stopped making sense, how he convinced himself his son would be better off without him. Those thoughts aren't you, Dr. Chin explained gently. They're symptoms of the depression, like the fever was a symptom of the pneumonia. But they felt so real, Mr. Thompson whispered. Depression lies, Dr. Chin said. It's very good at lying. That's why we need other people to help us see the truth. Later that evening, Jasmine found her mother in their kitchen, studying a thick employee handbook from William's company. How was Mr. Thompson today? Her mother asked, making space at the table. Better. He had his first therapy session. Jasmine hesitated. Mom, do you think he'll be okay living with William? Her mother set down the handbook. I think healing takes time and patience, and people who care enough to stick around even when it's hard. Like you did with me after Dad died. Her mother's eyes softened. Yes, baby. Like that? She pulled Jasmine into a tight hug. And maybe that's why you understood Mr. Thompson so well. You know what it's like to lose someone, to watch someone struggle with grief. The next day was Saturday, and William invited them to visit his home in Manhattan. The guest suite he prepared for his father was bigger than Jasmine's whole apartment. It might be too much at first, William admitted, showing them around. But we can modify it, make it more comfortable. What does Emma think about all this? Jasmine asked, thinking of William's daughter. Why don't you ask her yourself? William smiled as a girl Jasmine's age bounded into the room, curly hair flying. Are you Jasmine? Dad's told me all about you. Emma grabbed Jasmine's hand. Come see what I set up in Grandpa's room. Emma had created a small office area in one corner of the suite, complete with a desk and calculator. Dad says Grandpa was really good with numbers. Maybe he can teach us? That's very thoughtful, Emma, William said, his voice thick. The girls spent the afternoon planning how to decorate the rest of the suite while their parents discussed logistics. They were interrupted by a call from the hospital. Mr. Thompson had agreed to try family counseling. The first session was awkward. Mr. Thompson sat stiffly in his hospital bed while William perched on the edge of his chair. The counselor, Ms. Martinez, gently guided them through years of misunderstandings and unspoken fears. I thought I was protecting you, Mr. Thompson said. By leaving? You weren't, William replied, hands clenched. You just disappeared. Do you know what that did to me? Wondering if you were dead in a ditch somewhere. I'm sorry. The words seemed to physically pain Mr. Thompson. I wasn't thinking clearly. Depression does that, Ms. Martinez interjected softly. It isolates us, makes us push away the people we love most. But you're here now, William said. Both of us. That's what matters. Later that week, Jasmine's mother started her new job at Stellar Investments. She came home the first day looking tired but happy. How was it? Jasmine asked. Different. Good different. Her mother smiled. You know what William said when he hired me? He said they needed someone who could recognize when people were struggling before they reached their breaking point. Someone with empathy. Like how you understood why I had to help Mr. Thompson, even though you were scared. Exactly like that. Her mother kissed the top of her head. Sometimes the scariest part of helping someone is admitting they need help in the first place. The day Mr. Thompson was discharged from the hospital, it seemed like half the neighborhood turned up. Mrs. Rodriguez brought empanadas. Maria and her mother came with a warm blanket. Even Mr. Chun from the laundromat appeared with a card. The community looks out for its own, Mrs. Rodriguez declared, arranging food on the hospital room table. Mr. Thompson sat in a wheelchair, looking overwhelmed by the attention. I don't deserve all this. Everyone deserves kindness, Jasmine said firmly, adjusting his scarf. The same winter coat she'd given him had been cleaned and returned, but she insisted he keep the scarf. Besides, William added, you've got a granddaughter eager to learn accounting from Brooklyn's finest numbers man. I'm not sure I can do that anymore, Mr. Thompson admitted. The numbers still get mixed up sometimes. Then we'll figure it out together, William said. One day at a time. As they wheeled Mr. Thompson out to William's car, Jasmine noticed how different he looked from the man she'd first seen on that cold street corner. He was still thin, still fragile, but there was life in his eyes now. Hope. Thank you, he whispered as she helped him into the car. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Jasmine watched the car pull away, her mother's arm around her shoulders. The winter sun broke through the clouds, turning the dirty snow to diamonds. You know what, baby? Her mother said. I think we all learned something these past few weeks. What's that? That sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting dragons or saving the world. Sometimes it's just sharing your lunch with someone who needs it. Jasmine smiled, thinking of that first turkey and cheese sandwich. And sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference. That evening, as she helped her mother pack lunches for the next day, Jasmine noticed her making extra sandwiches again. Just in case, her mother said with a wink. You never know who might need a little kindness tomorrow. Ready for your first day? Jasmine's mother straightened her blazer in the mirror, still getting used to wearing office clothes instead of a waitress uniform. I think so. Jasmine packed her backpack, making sure to include the extra sandwiches her mother had made. This time, they were meant for her and Emma to share during their after-school visit to Mr. Thompson. The morning air was crisp but not bitter anymore. Spring was coming to Brooklyn, melting away the last patches of dirty snow. They walked together to the subway station, a new morning routine they both enjoyed. "Will you see Mr. Thompson today?" Jasmine asked as they descended the station stairs. "Probably. His office is right next to HR." Her mother smiled. "Still can't believe William convinced him to come in as a part-time consultant." The arrangement had started small, Mr. Thompson coming into the office once a week to help with some basic bookkeeping. But as his confidence grew, so did his responsibilities. "Emma says he's teaching her about spreadsheets," Jasmine said, thinking of her new friend's excitement about learning from her grandfather. Making up for lost time, her mother replied softly. They parted ways at the station. Jasmine to school, her mother to Manhattan. The familiar route to school felt different now. The neighborhood hadn't changed, but something else had. "Hey, Jasmine," Mrs. Rodriguez called from her bodega. "Tell your mother the empanadas were a hit at yesterday's community meeting." The community meetings had been her mother's idea. Once a month, neighbors gathered to discuss ways to help local homeless people. Mr. Thompson sometimes came to share his experience, though he still struggled with public speaking. At school, Emma was waiting by the front steps. In the 2 months since Mr. Thompson had moved in with William's family, the girls had become inseparable. "Grandpa's teaching me about tax returns today," Emma announced as they walked to class together. "He says it's never too early to learn financial responsibility." "Is he feeling better?" Jasmine asked. Mr. Thompson had seemed tired at their last visit. "Much better. The new medication is helping, and he's actually sleeping through the night now." Emma lowered her voice. "Dad says the therapy is helping too, even though Grandpa still gets grumpy about going sometimes." Miss Peterson passed them in the hallway, smiling warmly. She'd been supportive of Jasmine's friendship with Emma, especially after seeing how Mr. Thompson's story had affected the whole school. "Don't forget about your presentation today," she reminded them. The presentation had been Jasmine's idea, sharing their experience to teach other kids about homelessness and mental health. Mr. Thompson had helped them prepare, though he wouldn't be there in person. Some things were still too difficult. During lunch, they rehearsed one last time. "My grandfather wasn't just homeless," Emma practiced. "He was lost. Depression made him believe he didn't deserve help. Sometimes the people who need help the most," Jasmine added, "are the ones who find it hardest to ask for it." After school, they took the subway to Manhattan together, their mothers having arranged the play date days ago. William's apartment building still intimidated Jasmine a little, but the doorman knew her now, greeting her with a warm smile. They found Mr. Thompson in his suite, sitting at the small desk Emma had set up. Papers were arranged neatly around him, and a calculator sat within easy reach. "They're my favorite students," he said, looking up with a smile. His silver hair was neatly trimmed now, and he'd gained back some weight. The haunted look in his eyes had faded, though not completely disappeared. "How was your doctor's appointment?" Jasmine asked, setting up their after-school snacks. "Good news," he replied. "Dr. Chin says I'm making progress. The new medication seems to be working better." "And the numbers?" Emma asked hopefully. "Better some days than others." He tapped the calculator. "But that's why we have tools to help us, right?" They spent the afternoon learning about basic accounting principles, Mr. Thompson patiently explaining concepts in ways they could understand. When he got frustrated with himself for mixing up numbers, he took deep breaths like his therapist had taught him. "It's okay, Grandpa," Emma would say. "We could figure it out together." Later, William came home early from work, bringing Jasmine's mother with him. She'd adapted quickly to her new role at Stellar Investments, already implementing programs to help employees dealing with mental health issues. "The board approved our new initiative," William announced proudly. "Full mental health coverage for all employees and their families. And emergency housing assistance," Jasmine's mother added. "No one should have to choose between paying rent and getting help." Mr. Thompson grew quiet, looking out the window at the city skyline. "I keep thinking about others out there. People like I was. That's why we're starting the foundation," William reminded him. "Your experience is going to help a lot of people, Dad." The Thompson Foundation for Mental Health and Housing Assistance was still in its early stages, but William had big plans. Mr. Thompson would be a consultant, sharing his story to help others understand the connection between mental health and homelessness. Speaking of helping others, Jasmine's mother said, Mrs. Rodriguez asked if you'd speak at next month's community meeting, Thomas. Just for a few minutes. Mr. Thompson tensed slightly. I'm not sure. You don't have to, William said quickly. But your story matters. It could help someone else ask for help before they end up behind a dumpster in the snow. Mr. Thompson's attempt at humor fell flat. Before they forget they're worthy of love, Jasmine said quietly. The room fell silent. Mr. Thompson reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. When did you get so wise, young lady? She's always been wise, her mother said. Wise enough to see past fear to what really matters. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows through the apartment windows, they gathered around the dining room table. These family dinners had become a weekly tradition. The Thompsons and the Walkers, brought together by a simple act of kindness. I have an announcement, Emma said as they passed the salad bowl. Grandpa agreed to come to our presentation tomorrow. All eyes turned to Mr. Thompson, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Just in the back, he clarified. No speaking. But I think it's important to be there. William clasped his father's shoulder. I'm proud of you, Dad. Don't be proud yet, Mr. Thompson warned. I might still change my mind. That's okay, too, Jasmine's mother said. Recovery isn't a straight line. Sometimes we move forward. Sometimes we need to step back. What matters is we keep trying. After dinner, as they prepared to head home to Brooklyn, Mr. Thompson pulled Jasmine aside. I never properly thanked you, he said. For what? For the sandwich. For seeing me as a person when I'd forgotten how to see myself. He pulled something from his desk drawer, a small notebook. I've been keeping track of kindnesses, like accounting, but for the heart instead of money. You were the first entry. Jasmine hugged him, careful not to squeeze too hard. He was still fragile in some ways. Just promise you'll keep adding to it, she whispered. I promise. He smiled. After all, I have a lot of catching up to do. 1 month later, Malcolm X Boulevard looked different in the spring sunshine. The trees were budding, and someone had planted flowers in the small strip of dirt where Mr. Thompson used to sit. Jasmine paused on her way to school, remembering that first cold morning when she decided to share her sandwich. You're going to be late, her mother called from behind her, juggling her coffee and work bag. They still walked to the subway together every morning, a ritual neither wanted to give up. Just thinking, Jasmine said, falling in a step beside her mother. About Mr. Thompson's speech tonight? The community center was hosting its first major fundraiser for the Thompson Foundation. Despite his anxiety, Mr. Thompson had agreed to say a few words. What if it's too much for him? Jasmine worried. Then we'll be there to support him, her mother said simply. That's what family does. Family. The word had taken on new meaning these past months. It wasn't just her and her mother anymore. It had grown to include the Thompsons, the Rodriguez family, and what felt like half of Brooklyn. At school, Emma was waiting with news. Grandpa practiced his speech all morning. He only had to stop twice. The girls had front row seats reserved for the evening's event. They'd helped design the foundation's logo, a simple sandwich with the words "Small Acts, Big Changes" underneath. Did he use the breathing techniques? Jasmine asked as they headed to class. Yeah, and the new anti-anxiety medication helps too. Emma lowered her voice. Dad says he's doing better than anyone expected. Their first class was math, and Jasmine found herself smiling at the spreadsheet problems on the board. Mr. Thompson had been tutoring them both, turning numbers into stories that actually made sense. When you balance a budget, he'd explained during their last lesson, you're really balancing life, making sure there's enough of what matters. During lunch, they finalized their introductions for the evening's event. The Foundation's first project would be a mental health outreach program for homeless individuals, combining immediate assistance with long-term support. My dad says they've already raised enough money to help at least 50 people, Emma said proudly. And Mrs. Rodriguez got all the local businesses to pledge support, Jasmine added. The same shopkeepers who had once called the police on homeless people were now part of the solution. After school, they headed straight to the community center. The main room had been transformed, with chairs set up facing a small stage. Photos lined the walls, before and after images of people the foundation had already helped. Mr. Thompson was in the back room, pacing. I can't do this, he said when he saw them. There are too many people. You don't have to tell the whole story, Jasmine reminded him. Just the parts you're comfortable sharing. What if I freeze? What if the numbers get mixed up again? Then we'll be right there, Emma said, taking his hand. Front row, remember? William appeared with a glass of water and Mr. Thompson's medication. Take a few deep breaths, Dad. You've got this. People began arriving. Families from the neighborhood, business owners, social workers, and even some of Mr. Thompson's old colleagues from his accounting days. Jasmine's mother worked the room in her new role as the foundation's outreach coordinator. 5 minutes, Mrs. Rodriguez announced, peeking into the back room. The mayor just arrived. Mr. Thompson's hands started shaking. Maybe William should speak instead. Grandpa, Emma interrupted. Tell us about the numbers again. The ones that matter. He closed his eyes, centering himself. Right? The numbers that matter. 1 sandwich. 2 lives changed. 50 people helped so far. 100 more waiting for help. See? Jasmine squeezed his arm. You know the important numbers by heart. When it was time, Jasmine and Emma led Mr. Thompson to the stage. The room fell silent as he approached the microphone. 1 year ago, he began, voice shaking slightly. I was invisible. Depression had convinced me I didn't deserve to exist. I lost my job, my home, my family. But then, he looked at Jasmine. Then a little girl with a sandwich saw me. The story flowed easier after that. He talked about the shame of mental illness, the isolation of homelessness, the fear of asking for help. But he also talked about recovery, about family, about the power of small kindnesses. This foundation isn't just about providing services, he concluded. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. Because sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to share their lunch, to remind someone they're worthy of love. The applause was thunderous. William hugged his father as he left the stage. In the audience, Jasmine saw her mother wiping away tears. After the speeches, during the reception, people kept approaching Mr. Thompson to share their own stories. Each time he started to feel overwhelmed, he would touch the small notebook in his pocket, his kindness accounting, as he called it. Look, Emma whispered to Jasmine, pointing to a corner of the room. A group of business owners was talking with William, checkbooks out. More donations? Better, Emma grinned. They're offering jobs, real jobs for people in the program. Later, as the crowd thinned, Jasmine found Mr. Thompson sitting quietly by the photo display. He was looking at a particular image, himself on that cold street corner, taken by a local newspaper photographer. Hard to believe that was me, he said as she sat beside him. But it wasn't all of you, Jasmine replied. Just a part of your story. He pulled out his notebook. Want to know today's entry? She nodded. Learn that sharing your story, even the hard parts, might help someone else find their way home. That's a good one, Jasmine said. I have a lot of good ones now. He smiled. Thanks to a turkey and cheese sandwich. The next morning, life returned to its new normal. Jasmine and her mother walked to the subway, now carrying extra sandwiches for their regular visits to the homeless shelter where the foundation did outreach work. As they passed Malcolm X Boulevard, they saw Mrs. Rodriguez placing a small sign in her bodega window. No one goes hungry here. Other shops had similar signs. The laundromat offered free washing services once a week. The coffee shop had a suspended coffee program where customers could prepay for someone who couldn't afford it. Amazing how things change, her mother said. Amazing how people change, Jasmine corrected. At the subway station, before they parted ways, her mother handed her an extra sandwich. Just in case, she said with a wink. Just in case, Jasmine agreed. Because they both knew now that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the biggest changes. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to see past appearances, past fear, past rules that didn't always serve love. Sometimes all it took was a sandwich and a brave heart to remind someone they weren't invisible after all. And that, Jasmine had learned, was the most important number of all. One. One person. One moment. One choice to be kind. Everything else was just accounting.